Nearly every atheist laughs at the idea that Jesus performed miracles, and most non-Christian scholars do not think any miracles were actually performed. But despite this, most scholars do believe Jesus was known as a miracle worker in his time. Craig Keener says, "There is a general consensus among scholars of early Christianity that Jesus was a miracle worker. Claims of miracles were common in antiquity, but these claims took different forms." Although he disagrees with the consensus, Bart Ehrman says, "So abundantly attested are Jesus' miracle-working abilities that even scholars who are otherwise skeptical of the supernatural biases of our sources sometimes claim that whatever else one can say about him, Jesus was almost certainly a healer and an exorcist." To understand why this is, we need to dive into the data and see what has convinced most scholars. When it is surveyed, you'll see there is strong evidence that it was widely believed that Jesus performed miracles, which should make us wonder who this man really was. Maybe there is more to Jesus than meets the eye. When we look at what scholars say, most are convinced Jesus was known as a miracle worker in his lifetime, specifically as a healer and an exorcist. James D.G. Dunn says, "One of the most compelling features of the whole sweep of ancient opinion regarding Jesus is his reputation as an exorcist and a healer. It is no exaggeration to claim that it is one of the most widely attested and firmly established of the historical facts with which we have to deal." Paula Fredrickson said, "Yes, I think that Jesus probably did perform deeds that contemporaries viewed as miracles." E.P. Sanders said, "There is agreement on the basic facts. Jesus performed miracles, drew crowds, and promised the kingdom to sinners." Michael Grant said, "By far the deepest impression Jesus made upon his contemporaries was as an exorcist and a healer." Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar lists among the basic facts that we know about Jesus that there is little doubt that he was also a charismatic healer, an exorcist, and that he was eventually put to death by the Romans around the year 30 CE. Other scholars have argued this is true as well. Jesus was known in his lifetime as a miracle worker of some sorts. This doesn't mean all these scholars believe he actually did perform miracles, but the evidence suggests Jesus had a reputation of being able to work miracles. If you're shocked by this, you ought to know many of the reasons as to why so many are convinced. First, Jesus' miraculous abilities are multiply attested. They are in the material assigned to the hypothesized Q document, the Gospel of Mark, the extra material in Luke, in Matthew, and John. Additionally, the Gospels do not merely repeat the same miracles, but all have reports not found in the other Gospels. There are roughly 21 healing accounts, 4 additional accounts of exorcisms, 3 accounts of raising of the dead, or near dead, and 9 other miracle stories. This suggests the miracles of Jesus were so widely spread around that there were so many stories of him having miraculous power. Graham Twelftree says, "The witness of various literary forms in the Gospels also gives support to the view that Jesus performed miracles. There are biographical sayings, parables, a dispute story, sayings of instruction and commissioning, as well as the stories of exorcism, healing, raising the dead, and so-called natural miracles." In the Q material, we have Jesus giving summary statements that attest to his miraculous power. In Luke 7, Jesus says, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me." John Meyer notes this Q passage has a Semitic structure and reflects early material, indicating it is likely an authentic saying that goes back to Jesus and something he said. Craig Keener notes the miracle reported in the Q material comprises roughly half of all the narrative material in Q. It is also estimated that 31% of the verses in Mark involve miracles in some way, which is also 40% of his narrative material. John Meyer says, "The miracle traditions about Jesus' public ministry are already so widely attested in various sources in literary forms by the end of the first Christian generation that total fabrication by the early church is practically speaking impossible. Skeptics often bring up the fact that Paul doesn't mention Jesus' miracles, but this is not true. Paul does mention the most central miracle of Jesus, his resurrection. He also affirms Jesus is divine, and so it follows Paul would have thought Jesus had divine powers. But more importantly, Paul was dealing with other issues that didn't require him to refer back to the miracles of Jesus. And Paul affirms the people he was writing to already heard the gospel message. So there was no need to repeat stories they already knew, unless it was absolutely required. So this is nothing more than an argument from silence. Also, Paul mentions miracles he and other Christians were performing through the power of Christ. It is unlikely Paul believed that he and the other Christians could perform miracles, but Jesus never did. His own miraculous power is attributed to Christ working in them, supporting the notion he believed Jesus performed miracles. Paul also seems to allude to Jesus' line in Matthew 17:20 and 1 Corinthians 13:2. Graham Twelftree says, this probably echoes Jesus' saying about miracle-working faith. More importantly though, skeptics of Christianity acknowledge Jesus performed miracles, or that he had some type of power. Josephus said Jesus was a doer of wonderful works. Geza Vermes and Thomas Schmidt note this expression is not typical of Christian terminology for miracles, and is consistent with the way Josephus wrote. Kelsa said, it was by magic that Jesus was able to do miracles, which he appears to have done. The Babylonian Talmud said, on the eve of Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged, and a herald went forth before him 40 days heralding, Jesus the Nazarene is going forth to be stoned, because he practiced sorcery, and instigated and seduced Israel to idolatry. This report matches something we find in the Gospels, where the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out demons with the power of Beelzebub. Additionally, Tosefta Hulin mentions someone trying to heal a snake bite in the name of Yeshua. The Jerusalem Talmud mentions someone trying to perform a miracle in the name of Yeshua. Both of these reports suggest the name of Jesus was associated with miracle-working powers. Justin Martyr affirms the Jews of his day believed that Jesus performed miracles through magical arts. And the Jewish Toledat Yeshua reports Jesus performing miracles, including the claim that he rose to dead. Notice how none of these sources respond to Jesus' miracles by denying that they happened. Instead, they try to explain them away as sorcery or magic. Thus, we can say it was widely believed that Jesus had the ability to perform miracles. They are also central to much of the narrative of his life, as Gerd Thiessen and Annette Murr say. Just as the kingdom of God stands at the center of Jesus' preaching, so healing and exorcisms from the center of his activity. One could not tell the story of Jesus without including his miraculous powers. The gospel writers also say things about the miracles of Jesus that were unlikely to have been made up. This doesn't prove that Jesus performed miracles, but it does mean aspects of his miracles bear marks of authenticity. First, in the Q material, Jesus said mighty works were done in towns called Chorazin and Bethsaida. Chorazin is not mentioned in any of the detailed miracle stories of Jesus. If the gospel writers were crafting fiction, there would be no reason to mention some obscure town and not flesh out in detail the mighty works that were performed there. This is likely an early tradition that goes back to something Jesus uttered. Moreover, Jesus speaks of these towns being judged for rejecting him, despite miracles being performed there. It is also unlikely the gospel writers would make up a saying from Jesus himself, where he laments that people rejected him and his miracles. The gospel authors wanted to convince the world that Jesus is the Messiah, and giving room for doubt went against their goals. Similarly, Mark 6 tells us Jesus could not heal anyone in his hometown, which is something unlikely to have been made up. Craig Keener says, Mark would hardly have invented the idea that Jesus could not heal where faith was lacking. Mark 8 tells us Jesus healed a blind man, but Jesus had to lay hands on him twice. Again, this is an odd report to make up. If Mark or someone else was making up stories, why not report that Jesus was able to heal the man entirely the first time? Yet the gospel authors tell us Jesus could not perform miracles because some people lack faith. Jesus also used spit to heal him, which is an odd thing to make up. As Meyer notes, such an act does not fit with any Christological themes. It seems that if this story was made up, Jesus would have been successful the first time. He would not have used saliva. In Mark 5, Jesus healed a demon-possessed man by commanding the demon go into a herd of pigs, which runs into the sea and dies. It is unlikely later writers would have made up a story of Jesus destroying the livelihood of Gentile farmers. Verse 7 and 8 indicate the demons did not immediately come out when Jesus commanded them to, but attempted to resist. Again, we see Jesus' initial attempt was met with issues, something unlikely the early church would have made up. Also in Mark 5, a woman is healed by touching Jesus' garments. Then Jesus appears to not know who touched him, but only felt power go out of him. It is unlikely the church would make up a story where a woman was able to pull power out of Jesus and portray Jesus as ignorant of who did it. In Mark 7, Jesus heals the Canaanite's daughter, but Jesus refers to her as a dog, which could have been perceived as harsh by later Gentile converts. The woman appears to change Jesus' mind, and he goes through with the healing. The entire story is unlikely to have been made up by the early church, given that Jesus could be misconstrued as being rude and changes his mind. It likely goes back to a real interaction that occurred. In Mark 11, Jesus cursed a fig tree, and it dies as a result. This seems to be out of character for who Jesus was, since he was known to be loving and heal people. It served as a teachable moment for the disciples, but it seems to be an odd story for the church to have made up, and it doesn't make Jesus appear kind. Undesigned coincidences also show up in some miracle stories. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 occurs in all four Gospels, but each account comes with unexplained details that another Gospel has to account for. As noted, Matthew records that Jesus spoke of mighty works done in Bethsaida, but never mentions any miracles performed there. But Luke records that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred by Bethsaida, and Mark records that Jesus healed a blind man in that area. In Mark, the healing of the blind man happens after the feeding of the 5,000. He tells the man after to not even enter Bethsaida, apparently showing how serious Jesus was about the woes he pronounced on the town. But Mark doesn't mention the woes, and just says that Jesus took the man out of the town to heal him and didn't allow him to return, as an unexplained illusion. Thus Luke and Mark explain the saying in Matthew, and Matthew explains something in Mark. John also doesn't tell us that miracles happen in Bethsaida, but in his account, Jesus asked Philip where they could buy bread for the people. Earlier in John, we see that Philip was from Bethsaida. So Luke also explains the existence of this question in John. Jesus asked Philip because he was from the region, which John doesn't connect in the actual passage of the feeding of the 5,000. Another aspect of the miracle is that Mark specifically mentions Jesus commanding the people to sit down on green grass. This is odd because the grass isn't often green in the land of Israel, but Peter J. Williams notes it is green in the spring after the winter rains fall. John accounts for why Mark says the grass was green, because he says the miracle occurred when the Passover was at hand. Williams also notes that John 6:9 informs us that the loaves Jesus multiplied were barley loaves, which aligns with the miracle immediately following the barley harvest around Passover. Mark 6 also says many people were coming and going, but he doesn't say why. If pilgrims were heading to Jerusalem for Passover, this would explain the line in Mark. So John explains these details in Mark and doesn't appear to be doing so on purpose, since the details are not in view in his gospel. John does this in one other place. A question that arises is, how did the evangelist know there were about 5,000 men for this miracle? How did they single out the men to count them? Mark says they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, which would have made them easier to count. But John, who doesn't mention this detail, adds that it was specifically the men who sat down. so John explains this detail in Mark, which in turn explains how all the gospel authors knew the rough estimate of men. In John 18, Jesus said, "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews." But prior to this, we see Peter cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Why would Jesus make such a claim if Malchus had just been attacked? Luke supplies the answer. Jesus had healed his ear, removing the evidence of the attack. John does not report that the ear was healed, so Luke explains this issue in John. There are several other undesigned coincidences in the gospel accounts that we covered in another video. Needless to say, if the gospel writers were crafting fiction, they would not have created unexplained details that other gospel writers happened to account for by accident. This shows us some of the miracle stories bear marks of authenticity. It is also reported in the Gospels that Jesus also performed miracles by his own word. This is dissimilar to how the Old Testament prophets perform miracles, by acting in the name of God. Jesus merely spoke a word and performed miracles. It is odd that the miracles, if fictional, do not mimic how the prophets of old performed them. Raymond Brown says, "The lines of demarcation between Jesus and God in this intervention are very vague. The kingdom comes both in and through Jesus. The power to do the healings and other miracles belongs to God, but also to Jesus." Jesus' miracles were also for a specific purpose, unlike what we find in the Hebrew Bible. His miracles were meant to proclaim that the kingdom of God had arrived. They had a unique aspect in why they were performed, which is unlike other miracle accounts. Thyssen and Murs say, "The uniqueness of the miracles of the historical Jesus lies in the fact that healings and exorcisms, which take place in the present, are recorded in eschatological significance. Nowhere else do we find a charismatic miracle worker whose miraculous deeds are meant to be the end of an old world and the beginning of a new one." As noted, it was well known Jesus was thought to be an exorcist, but Graham Twelftree notes, reports of exorcisms are surprisingly few in the early church in the generations after Jesus. This means that it is difficult to argue that the early Christians were projecting their ministry back onto the historical Jesus. Instead, it is more likely that exorcism was part of the ministry of the historical Jesus. It is also unlikely that later Christian writers were projecting miracles back onto Jesus, because we need to ask why none were projected back onto John the Baptist as well, especially since he was compared to Elijah, one of the greatest miracle workers from the Hebrew Bible. Surely if the early church was making up miracles, then John would have been ascribed Elijah-like miracles as well. This all suggests many of the miracle stories about Jesus do not bear the marks of fiction, but bear marks of authenticity. When Graham Twelftree surveyed the miracles of Jesus based on Semitisms, embarrassing features, dissimilarity, multiple attestations, and plausibility, he concluded that at least 22 miracle stories have a high level of confidence of being reliable accounts that go back to early reports about Jesus. Again, this is not to say this is proof these miracles did occur, but we also must note we cannot dismiss them as mere fictional accounts. They do bear several marks of authenticity that cannot be overlooked. Before moving on, one more important aspect of Jesus' miracles is that they were told in a hostile environment. His miracles were meant to show that he was king of the world and the Jewish Messiah. Both the Romans and the Jews were against such claims. It didn't do the Christians any favors to make up and attribute so many miracles to Jesus. Such claims resulted in waves of persecution for proclaiming Jesus as Lord. It would have been much easier if they simply would have taught he was a wise teacher without attributing so much power to him, which was seen as a threat to Jewish and Roman authority. To attribute so much power and authority resulted in problems for the Christians. Now, some argue miracle stories were relatively common in the ancient world, and so making up stories about miracle workers was a cultural norm, as people were gullible enough to fall for such claims. But this is not entirely true. When we compare Jesus to other miracle workers of his time, based on the sources we still have, miracles were attached to a relatively few number of historical individuals. Werner Kahl surveyed roughly 150 miracle stories from antiquity and only found one other figure before Philostratus' Life of Apollonius that was claimed to perform numerous miracles, similar to the amount that was said about Jesus. And that was Melampus. But he was written about in antiquity and said to have lived in the distant legendary past. His historicity is questionable, whereas Jesus was written about much closer to the time he lived. Graham Twelftree says, coupled with this is the point that in the period of 200 years on each side of the life of the historical Jesus, the number of miracle stories attached to any historical figure is astonishingly small. When we hone in on the figures that lived around the time of Jesus, we have in total 5 claimed miracle workers: Honi the Circle Drawer, Hananiah ben Dosa, Apollonius of Tyana, Vespasian, and Simon Magus. Also, none of these figures were said to have performed the amount of miracles Jesus was said to perform. Gerd Thyssen says, nowhere else do we have traditions of so many miracles by a single miracle worker, with the exception of cult sanctuaries. Honi was said to have lived in the 1st century BC or prior. He is attested in Josephus, the Talmud, and the Mishnah, and they all were written over 100 years after he lived. It was said that if there was a drought, Honi would sit in a circle and pray to God until it rained. When drops would fall, Honi complained the rain was too little, so God sent more. The account in the Mishnah is far more embellished than what we find in the earlier account of Josephus, and also places Honi much further in the past. Hananiah ben Dosa is only attested in the Mishnah. He lived in the 1st century AD, but the accounts of his miracles are from the 3rd century. It was said he had a ministry of praying for the sick, and he would know which of his prayers would be answered and which would not. When we compare these 2 Jewish miracle workers to Jesus, we find that the miracle stories were written over 100 years later. They performed relatively few, and they did not rely on their own power, but prayed to God for his power. Even if someone could argue these accounts are more reliable, they would still be consistent with a Christian worldview, since they only called on God to create miracles. Meanwhile, the miracles of Jesus are attested much closer to his life. They are far more in abundance, and he was able to perform miracles by his own word. John Meyer says, in the end, one must admit that all the written sources are later than Jesus, and almost all of them centuries later. I'd venture to claim that, beyond the fact that around the turn of the era, there existed 2 Jews in Palestine named Honi and Hananiah, both of whom were famous for having their prayers answered in extraordinary ways. Nothing definite can be said. When we look at Vespasian, it was said he healed a blind man and a lame man in Egypt on his way to Rome to assure his throne. His miracle story is attested by both Tacitus and Suetonius, and they did write less than 50 years after the event allegedly happened. However, the story was told in an environment where one was to honor the emperor, and not a hostile one like what the Christians were facing. The whole affair seems to have been concocted to give Vespasian legitimacy as emperor, since he was not from the rightful line of Caesars and instead took power after a civil war. Meyer says, Suetonius and Tacitus seem to tell the whole story with a twinkle in their eyes and smiles on their lips, an attitude probably shared by Vespasian. The whole event looks like a 1st century equivalent of a photo opportunity staged by Vespasian's PR team to give the new emperor divine legitimacy. Apollonius of Tyana was said to live in the 1st century, and he was said to perform several miracles like healing the sick, casting out demons, and raising the dead. But what we know about him comes from one source, Philostratus' Life of Apollonius, written almost 200 years after he lived. The material in it is also incredibly inaccurate. Howard Key Clark says, the material allegedly drawn from Damas is so full of historical anachronisms and gross geographical errors that one could not have confidence in Damas as a reporter if there were actually a diary. In fact, many scholars have noted Philostratus appears to be drawing from the miracle accounts in the Gospels and Acts. Craig Keener says, a number of his accounts of Apollonius even resemble reports from Christian Gospels, though most frequently of the apocryphal variety. Given the relative dates, Christian stories would have been at least among the significant potential influences on his storytelling approach, offering literary fodder for miracle stories. So Philostratus seems to have been crafting his stories based on known stories about Jesus to create a pagan version of him. Simon Magus is mentioned in the book of Acts, and in much later Christian accounts, which are agreed to be unreliable. In Acts, it is said that he practiced magic, but this is too vague to obtain a good picture of what he specifically did. His power is talked of as something with suspicion, and not on the level of what the disciples were able to do. So the account is too vague to gain a coherent picture of any miracles performed. When we compare the evidence for Jesus' miracles with that of the other claimed miracle workers from around his time, we see that the evidence for Jesus' miracles has far more support. His miraculous power is multiply attested, bears several marks of authenticity, and were written very close to the time that Jesus lived. The other miracle workers of the time do not have the same level of reliability that we find with Jesus. As R.H. Fuller said, "The tradition that Jesus did perform exorcisms and healings, which may also have been exorcisms originally, is very strong." These are some of the reasons as to why most scholars are convinced that Jesus was known as a miracle worker in his lifetime. The data strongly indicate Jesus was well known to perform miracles. As Michael Grant said, "By far the deepest impression Jesus made upon his contemporaries was as an exorcist and a healer. In any case, he was not only believed to possess some quite special curative gifts, but evidently, in some way or the other, he actually possessed them." Since this is the case, it should at least give us reason to consider Jesus was more than a mere man. There are some interesting reasons to consider that Jesus may be who he said he was. Given the marks of authenticity, the stories about him may be true, and may point to something unique happening in history. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.